Hello and welcome to Collapse Club, where our topic is, how are we to live in the time of collapse? I am David Baum in Seattle, and with me today is Jessica Canham from the island of Dominica. Hello, Jessica.
Hello, David. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you. Jessica and I met and became colleagues in deep adaptation, and you're now on the holding group for deep adaptation, right?
That's right.
And you do a lot on the island. Could you introduce yourself a little in terms of your role in the society there?
Sure. Well, Dominica, for those who don't know, is an Eastern Caribbean island. It's not to be confused with the Dominican Republic, which is the Spanish-speaking island beside Haiti. We're actually between Martinique and Guadeloupe. It's a very small English-speaking island. And right now, you're up here at Cappy Cottage Retreats, which is a retreat space in the mountains, just on the edge of the rainforest. We're at 1,500 feet above sea level. And it's a balmy, probably 26 degrees right now. Along with my partner, Tim, have been managing Cappy Cottage Retreats for the last several years, where we host wellness gatherings, student groups, international student groups and regional groups, transformational experiences, and we do a lot of community building as well. In my community, I'm on the board of the Farmers Group and also involved with the Health and Wellness Association. And I'm also a director on the Hotel and Tourism Association for the island. And we have the main industries here are agriculture, but we do have some tourism. Ecotourism has been really rising, and most of it is family owned and very much sustainable.
Thank you. In a recent blog post on the Deep Adaptation blog, you make an argument, or you portray Dominica as having preserved several important qualities or characteristics that other islands in the Caribbean and other places around the world have lost. And I wonder if you could talk about what has been preserved and why it's important.
Thank you, David. Yeah, I wanted to, on our occasion of our 44th anniversary of independence, to sort of celebrate and point out some of the really important qualities now that we have in this community. We develop very differently than the other islands, where there's a lot of mass tourism. Dominica, because of its mountainous topography, it did not become a really broadly colonial place. It was still quite independent minded. And so we didn't have the same kind of colonization that the other islands had. So I had 4 lessons for the world. It's a little bit presumptuous, but I wanted to say what the 4 lessons that people could take from this island, where we still have a lot of cultural heritage and things that have been kept. And to do that, I want to first of all show you a little bit about where I am. So I'm going to share my screen as I talk. Let's get this share screen button. There we go. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
So what you're seeing is, this is where I am. This is the community that we're in, Cochrane, and this is Cappy Cottage Retreats. So wow. We had, I'll mention before I go into the lessons, that's Category 5 Hurricane Maria. And in 2017, it absolutely devastated the island. It looked like a nuclear bomb had gone off. It was completely flattened. Most bridges, roads, houses, roofs. And for 10 months, there was no central grid. There was no power. There was very little water functioning. And people really had to fend for themselves until we got international aid. So the first lesson for from Dominica to the world is Coud Men, which is the Creole word for lend a hand. And it's a cultural trait that's been maintained in Dominica over hundreds of years. It's really the equivalent of community self-help or mutual aid. And so it's when people come together, there's a spirit of helping each other. It's in places where there's not a lot of money or not a lot of services and resources. People need to come together to help people with their roofs, to put up a goat fence, to help plant a vegetable bed. And that's something that has been retained over centuries actually. The second lesson is about the land. When we take care of the land takes care of us. And it's in our motto, après Bondy, c'est la terre, after God, the earth. We're an agrarian society. Most people are subsistence farmers or have farming in their family. And this really has sustained Dominica over generations. And so people still know how to farm here. Whereas in other islands in the Caribbean, where tourism was very aggressively developed, people were taken off the land and put into the service industry. And we actually have not had that happen. So most people still have access to land. And it was also a place where we have what's called the Negmawan, which are the escaped slaves. We had a big Negmawan community in Dominica because of the mountains, and they could actually escape and set up communities in the forests. There's a lot of understanding about plants and their uses, and older people in the community really understand medicinal herbs and know where to find them. There's still foraging that happens. And so there's this idea that the land will provide and sustain us. Some of these images you're seeing are retreats at Cappy Cottage that we have here from time to time. The third lesson is grow what we eat, that food security is really in our gardens and it's in our hands. And this is just a continuation of really the second lesson, which industrial agriculture has kind of done the opposite in a lot of places. It's removed people from the land. It's provided this kind of global supply chain of things coming from far away. Most of the fruits and vegetables are eaten locally here, and they're eaten in season. And this is really a sustaining way of living. So we say we're land rich and cash poor in Dominica, which means most people, again, own land or families own land, but might not have a lot of cash. But again, the land provides. Other things that are in our policies that allow people to stay on their land is that there's no property tax in most places outside of Roseau. So people are not disenfranchised because they can't pay the taxes for the land. And we also have squatters' rights, which mean that if a squatter is on an abandoned land, it's really to support low-income people. If they're on an abandoned land for over 12 years, then they have certain rights to that property. Then these are all things that are really enshrined in our identity, our policies, our laws, and the land and the people are really one in Dominica in a way. We still have to fight against things like fertilizers and pesticides and things that have been coming in the last few years. I'll stop sharing. As global industrial agriculture, we're certainly not immune to the sort of the encouragement to use fossil fuel fertilizers and that kind of thing. But there is also a movement back to organic farming, permaculture, which is all the rage in the north, while permaculture principles were things that our ancestors just knew how to do and were done in Dominica. So the fourth lesson is learn practical skills for living. So one of the things that I like to talk about in my community, there's only 380 people, but I can find a nurse, a doctor, plumbers, carpenters, stonemasons, electricians, bus drivers, police officers, pastry chefs, mechanics. I mean, just about anything that I need in terms of skills, there's probably someone who has those skills. And that's really important, especially after an emergency, to not be isolated, to be able to come together as a community and provide each other with the support and the resources that are needed. And that has been, something that I've learned because I grew up in the global north. And so being here and recognizing that everybody's got 3 or 4 different skills, everybody wears a few different hats out of necessity, but of course the benefits are to the whole community. Yeah, so I'll stop there if you have any questions about any of those. So those are the 4 kind of key practical lessons that I think are really important for deep adaptation in these times when industrial civilization, industrial society, supply chains are breaking down, weather's changing, a lot of the things that we've counted on to come in might not be there, in times of crisis or just, as things unravel.
The value of the skills that you mention are obvious. The the thing that strikes me about your portrait, beautiful presentation, by the way, thank you for that. The thing that strikes me about the portrait of the island, the community there, is the human scale of it. It's not huge. The challenges that we face on a global scale are truly immense. And I wonder if you have thoughts about how the relationships and qualities that you're talking about can inform response to collapse on a larger scale.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, I think it's important that we sort of back up, and when we hear the word collapse, I think what people really mean is that, when is collapse coming for me? Because collapse has happened in so many places over so many times, so many periods, whether, you look at Pakistan and the floods, and the 2/3 of the country is still underwater. You look at the history of colonization, that really drove collapse. 15 million Africans were kidnapped from West Africa and brought to the Caribbean and North America. And the brutality of that system over hundreds of years, and societies really suffering, of course, extermination of indigenous people in North America and South America. So collapse has come in waves for different people at different times. But I think in the global north, the question now is, because it's coming back around to bite people in the wealthy countries with extreme weather and with instability of supply chains and that kind of thing. So it's important for, I think, everyone to recognize that, collapse is here. It's just not evenly distributed, as William Gibson said, famously. And so how different communities have been dealing with collapse. We've been dealing with hurricanes in the last, couple of generations. That's been a huge challenge, is the weather. And we build for that. We build for hurricanes, we build for earthquakes. We talk about this all of the time. We talk about preparing for hurricane season. We have community networks that are ready there for emergencies, whether it's Red Cross community or training in first aid and CPR and that kind of thing. And so this is something that is not new to us or strange. And I think it's just a matter of others outside of, the global South, recognizing that they're not immune to the things that we've been experiencing and continue to experience, and to understand the roots of them as well. Because I think that, this is very closely tied to what I would call climate justice, and recognizing that the countries that have really done the least to cause the problems, the crisis that we're living in, ecological collapse and the climate collapse, are going to suffer and have been suffering, the worst, and we're sort of on the forefront. And it's not as if our suffering is not going to affect people in the global north. It will. And so I think it's important for us to create more links and more solidarity between communities, in the industrial countries and in the global South, to hear each other's experience, learn from each other, and support each other. One of the things I wanted to talk about was the recent COP at 27 in Egypt. And that there was it was disappointing on many, many levels, but the one thing that came out of that people were quite hopeful about was the loss and damage agreement. And this is the wealthy countries, the G20 produce 75% of carbon emissions. Pakistan produces 1%, for example. So the G20 recognizes that they have a responsibility for the loss and damage that is coming, that's already baked in, and it's coming for small island states and places, other places in the South, that they should be paying for that and helping to help rebuild infrastructure, to help allow us to survive, as many people to survive as possible. But it's very vague. It's a $300 billion a year pact, but who's going to contribute to that? What is it going to cover? Is it just going to cover infrastructure like roads and bridges? Or is it going to also cover ecosystems like rainforests, and coral reefs? Because when we lose those provide us with amazing services, and we're going to be suffering a lot when we lose our forests and our coral reefs and even glaciers. So it's a good signal that at least the wealthy countries acknowledge that they have some responsibility, but they don't want to be held liable. So they don't really go far enough on that. So I think it's up to ordinary citizens in those countries can advocate on our behalf, can keep that issue on the table, keep it in the press, keep writing about it, because those dollars will make a difference. If we get even a fraction of this $300 billion fund or whatever it is, it can save lives, and it can help us to reduce harm, wherever we are in the world.
Yeah, one kind of gets the feeling that the promises of help which never materialize and the minimal help that does finally reach people, it's basically a gloss on the determination of the rich countries to stay rich and to maintain their unsustainable lifestyles. And that's going to bring us all down. That's what it looks like to me. But it sounds like, do you feel that there are real concrete opportunities for collaboration between the global north and the global south? Is collaboration the right model to be thinking about?
Yeah, I think there are opportunities. I see some partnerships, even in the Deep Adaptation Network. We have a decolonizing circle, and they've been experimenting with supporting projects in the global south and doing some anti-racist work with people who are open to that and want to really look at their internalized racism and biases and framing that has kept this system in place. I think there's an opportunity. I think, again, the responsibility is on, the wealthy countries and those in the north to get uncomfortable and be in these uncomfortable places, not kind of run away from feelings of guilt or uncertainty, and lean into that discomfort and recognize that that's really where the learning starts, So it's okay to be uncomfortable. Our society is so predicated on being as comfortable as possible and reducing anxiety and reducing stress and reducing all these things. But in many ways, these are the areas that we need to look at, because the planet is incredibly stressed and millions of people are very stressed. And so if we can have some empathy and we can sort of extend our caring beyond our immediate family circle and community to distant places and distant people, then we will start to really understand, to untangle things and to have opportunities to heal and to reduce harm.
I think the question of responsibility is a really central one. And the legacy of colonialism, which is a history of brutality and exploitation that is hard to imagine. Some people, I don't have to imagine it. And you helped me realize that my viewpoint, as much as I know about the global situation and about the inequities affecting the global South, my perspective really is that of a white man in the global North. And it's useful to be reminded that me sitting here in an industrialized capital, waiting for something to happen, that is not what probably most people experience as collapse. They're going through it. Their food is expensive or unavailable. There's been a disaster lately. That is becoming the experience of a lot more people. However, let me ask your advice or your opinion about someone in my position. in the global north who is aware of these issues and wants to be active, the situation that I face is that my government, the powers that be, are firmly aligned with, number one, the historical forces of colonialism, and number two, the very current forces of exploitation, which will lead to disaster. And contrary to the propaganda, those powers that be are not amenable to democratic input, not really. Push come to shove, they listen to the money. So what insights do you have, perhaps, from your experience or your learning about how to cope with intractable authority?
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's a huge issue. I mean, that's why things are the way they are, of course. But change has only happened, through people power, through revolutions. All of the rights that we've ever gotten have come from people standing up, regular people putting their lives sometimes on the line, putting their reputations on the line, being whistleblowers and standing up. It's the same with the suffragettes, women getting the vote. The end of slavery, even when we go 3 steps forwards, 2 steps back. But the movements that I really respect and get excited about are like Extinction Rebellion, because I think when they came on the scene, it's a question what direction they're going now, but they were really able to mobilize people in a way that enabled them to sort of understand the urgency in a way that also brought together community and also brought together a different way of mobilizing. There's amazing people that I admire that are really fighting to get attention and to these issues and to help bring people along with them. We did a story on the Fairy Creek blockade, which was quite incredible out in BC. I mean, there's 2% of old growth forest left, and the government wants to take, and the logging industry wants to take the rest of it. And there's an Indigenous communities there that are coming together and inviting other Canadians and people around the world to say, no, enough is enough. We have to protect at least what's left. And they call that the last stand. And so there's a lot of these movements going on. They don't necessarily get a lot of press until they're huge, but they have had lots of victories. Whether it's the pipeline victory, pushing back against the pipeline expansion. And it's interesting because most of these movements are led by BIPOC people, people of African descent, Black people or Indigenous people. Black Lives Matter is another group. And because, we've had this history and this understanding that the government is not going to be supporting and protecting our rights if we don't demand it. And I think it's a new thing for, the average white man in the global north to all of a sudden realize, well, maybe the government's not going to protect my rights either, because now as things unravel and as resources are more and more scarce, they're being put in the same position that people of color have always been in. So it's about really finding the solidarity, finding these points of commonality where we can say, well, if we lose our rights, you're next. And so we need to come together and support each other's struggles. And we can make a difference if we come together. But I think that there's this capitalism and the systems that we're in really works to create barriers between people. Sally Weintraub calls it the culture of uncare. So there's this idea that we don't really care about anything beyond our own family and our own kind of neighborhood and community. And if we're good, then that's fine. And that's what is encouraged. It's this very individualistic culture that's encouraged. And Indigenous cultures and cultures from other times have recognized that we have to think as a community and we have to move together, because otherwise it'll just be divide and conquer.
I think it is the last stage of empire when they start treating the homeland like a colony and simply extract whatever profit is available from the people and from the land. And finally, ultimately, they have nothing left to exploit because it's all gone. And that's the point of collapse.
Yeah, it's that image of the snake eating its tail, and that this idea that this capitalism does cannibalize itself eventually, because it's about taking those natural resources and people, putting them through the system to produce goods and services, destroying everything in the process, and just going down and down and down until there's nothing left. And unfortunately, that's the trajectory we're on. And it's, most of my thinking, my work, my initiative is trying to figure out how do we become a resilient community to survive this process, to create little pockets, where we can be equal, little pockets where we can still have joy and have some autonomy and be self-sufficient. So we're not going to be as, crushed necessarily as much when the system, does start to come down.
You mentioned the culture of uncaring. I put that down ultimately in the global north to a spiritual bankruptcy, that the religious systems of the past 500 or 2,000 years or 5,000 years have proven that they result in a separation between humans and the natural world, with results that we can now see. I wonder if you have experience of spiritual or religious currents that are attached to the land that provide a better connection between humans and the earth.
Well, just I mean, certainly I'm always drawn to Buddhism because of this this idea of practicing being present, being present in nature especially, and not having somebody telling you how to be or how to feel, but really to be present in your humanity and as a biological being. But to go back to that idea of uncare, I wouldn't necessarily blame it on any religion. I think it's more about this global capitalism has really forced us into a way of living that actively separates us from the huge environmental damage and the social damage that's being done in order to provide us with all of these goods and services. I mean, the screen we're talking on and the cell phones we have, I mean, what goes into those rare earth minerals and lithium and how they're being mined in the poorest places of the world that are just atrocious conditions. We're really separate from that reality. Nobody is reporting on that, showing us images of that. Very few. You really have to dig for that. So there's a complete shield. It's like we're living in a very unreal world, most people in the industrial world, of how things really arrive, at our doorstep, how the whole set of living arrangements is kept going. And when you start to feel into that and the from industrial animal agriculture to mining to extraction, fossil fuels, when you start to feel into that, it is really extremely disturbing. But I do think that holds us the key to how we could actually shift that, if it's even possible. But feeling that, at a very visceral level, and understanding that it's affecting us all at a really psychological level. You can see this in mental health issues and anxiety and stress. It's not a healthy way to be, even though we're supposedly wealthy in the industrial north. It's not healthy. And so I think it's important to recognize that, to be able to separate ourselves from such a system.
Yeah. The pollution and the damage is not included in the economic modeling. Those are called externalities. But it turns out there's no external. It's all part of one system. So if you perpetuate that pollution and damage over centuries, you're going to kill your own environment, which is what we are finding now.
Mhm.
I wonder, the activities that you describe in your blog post were about the recovery from the Hurricane Maria in 2017. I wonder what is ongoing in your community. What is there an effort to continue the building of these connections?
Yeah, well, I would say that they came in very useful after in the aftermath of the hurricane, but these lessons are generally cultural and social traits that Dominica has maintained. I mean, to varying degrees depending on the community. But the coup de main, which we celebrate with the National Day of Service every year, that is ongoing. So, you know, there'll be an announcement in our village, okay, we're going to fix this patch of road, everybody come, or we're going to install this this greenhouse for so and so. And these are kinds of, that goes on all the time. It's not just after disasters. Um, and like I was saying, because there's not a lot of, it's not a wealthy island. We don't have tons of money coming in from outside. People actually have to have the skills to do things like repair their plumbing and their electrician, you know, their electricians. And lots of people are mechanics because people don't have the money to pay for those services. And we don't, frankly, don't have a lot of those services to choose from. So by necessity, and this is something you find in many places where there isn't a lot of money, people develop skills by necessity. And I think that's the key to living well too. People are actively engaged in their lives. They know where things come from. They know how to be a bit self-sufficient. It gives people a lot of pride to be able to do things for themselves. And then it forces people also to work together. So we're not sort of siloed in apartments, you know, where we don't talk to our neighbors. We can't live like that in a place that's based on agriculture.
And that has human benefits as well as economic benefits. People actually know other people and make human relationships, unlike a lot of urban society where people are so isolated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we co-regulate each other. You know, we're biological beings, so we need each other to psychologically and emotionally. Even if you don't get along with your neighbor, you know, it's still important to interact and figure out, do problem solving and solve ways to move forward.
But those relationships are under pressure even today from the colonial impulses that still drive the global economy, I think. You had mentioned that there's an effort on Dominica to restore land that has already been degraded by monoculture, chemical-based agriculture. How is your community resisting the pressure of present-day colonialism?
Mm-hmm. It's a struggle because, you know, it's in many cases it's cheaper to spray as opposed to using a brush cutter or a cutlass to get out weeds. So when people don't have a lot of money and they're given, you know, chemical fertilizers, often if they're not really conscious, they will choose the chemical fertilizers if it's about the bottom dollar. But we do a lot with the farmers group in terms of educating and doing a lot of workshops and ways that you can deal with pests in an organic way, and deal with different bacteria and things on plants, and also understanding soil health and how important that is for human health, and how you're going to get larger yields over time if we don't use those harmful chemicals. So there's a lot of education, but there's also a lot of issues around the next generation and getting them to want to be involved in agriculture, because there's an aging population of farmers and a lot of young people who are very tuned into what's happening internationally and want better paying jobs and that kind of thing are very drawn to go overseas. But I do see that changing, and I see a lot of young people who went overseas coming back and being interested in the land, and not being as satisfied as they thought with urban living, and recognizing the value of being in a beautiful place that's a little slower pace, where you have longer lunches, and you spend time on the river, and it's quality of life. These things, I think this next generation are more tuned into maybe than my generation was. And because also they're priced out of the housing market, in most places in the North. Forget about owning a house in Toronto or New York if you're in your 20s, unless, it's just for the average young person. So where you can still have a high quality of life, I think people are slowly coming to that awareness and understanding it's not all about money and the bling.
Very interesting. Well, Jessica, I've got one more question for you, but I want to thank you for being with me today and sharing your insight. The final question is a big picture, so feel free to range as you will. What do you think is necessary for climate justice to happen?
Wow, that's a huge one. Yeah, and I certainly am not qualified to really answer that. When I think about that, my feeling is, is really holding, and there's a little bit of an in with this loss and damage fund, with a little bit of an in, and I'm not saying it's going to be the solution, but if people hold governments to account, if somehow they can put pressure on their governments to follow through, and it means getting on the street, it means disrupting, it means boycotting, it's a lot of things that are involved. People have to be ready for the discomfort if they really want justice, because it's going to be a push. The governments and the corporations are not going to give up the power that they have and the resources willingly. They're only going to give those up if they're pushed. So am I optimistic? The trends are not looking good. Yeah, I see the slivers of people being able to maybe create little pockets, of places where we can experiment with something new. But overall, big picture, it's looking pretty bleak. But that's why I'm even more determined to make sure, that I have the skills, that I'm passing on skills, that we're developing them collectively in the community to really weather what's coming.
Well, thank you for that. That's a very hopeful and also realistic point of view, it seems to me. It's like, what else can we do? We push for the best that we can achieve, and then we prepare to deal with whatever comes, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and remember, most of human history, it was wars and plagues and people dying young. Most of human history was not like the last 50 years. So we are living in a little anomaly, and a little explosion, from the fossil fuel economy, which has been a great ride for some people. A very tiny little minority of people have had a big party, and the party's coming to an end. But I think there's still a lot of beauty and there's a lot of joy outside of that, because we've always been able to find that as human beings.
Fantastic. Jessica, I want to thank you very much for being here today. This is Jessica Canham from the island of Dominica in the Caribbean. I am David Baum in Seattle. This was Collapse Club. Until we meet again, farewell.
Thank you, David. Farewell.
Thank you.